Someone made an assumption about you today based on where you are right now. Maybe they saw your old car, your apartment in the cheaper part of town, the job you have that's clearly not your dream. And you could see it in their face. That quick calculation. That judgment. That conclusion that what you have now is all you'll ever have. That where you are is who you are. And they don't know. They have no idea what you're doing after you clock out. What you're learning during your lunch breaks. What you're building in the hours between work and sleep. They don't see the courses you're taking, the skills you're developing, the plan you're executing one small step at a time. They just see the surface, the survival job, the tight budget, the present that looks like it might be your permanent. But you know something they don't. This isn't your life. This is your foundation. This isn't who you are. This is what you're doing while you become who you're meant to be. And their underestimation doesn't sting the way it used to. Just fuels you, because you're keeping track. Not in some petty way, but in this very clear way where you're noting who saw your potential when potential was all you had, and who wrote you off based on temporary circumstances. This became real for me about 1.5 years ago. I was working retail. Not as a career move, just as the thing that paid rent while I figured out my actual direction. And I'd gone back to school taking night classes trying to build towards something better. But during the day, I was folding clothes and ringing up customers and wearing a name tag. And I ran into someone I knew from high school. Someone who'd gone straight to college, landed a good job, was clearly doing well. And we did that awkward catching up thing, where you're both trying to figure out how honest to be. And they asked what I was doing these days. I told them about the retail job first because that was the obvious answer. The thing I spent most of my waking hours doing. And I saw their face change. Not dramatically. Just this subtle shift. This recalibration of how they were going to treat me. Like I'd become someone different than who they remembered. Someone who'd ended up working retail instead of doing something significant. And I almost left it there. Almost let them have their judgment. But something in me couldn't. So I mentioned that I was also in school. Taking classes toward a different career. Building something on the side. And they nodded, but I could tell they were filing that away as something I was trying, not something that was going to work. Like school was just what people say when they don't want to admit their job is their only option. They told me about their career. Their apartment downtown. Their recent promotion. All said in a way that was supposed to sound like catching up but felt more like establishing hierarchy. Like making sure I understood the distance between where they were and where I was. And I smiled and congratulated them and asked appropriate follow-up questions. But inside I was doing my own calculation. I was noting that they had no idea what my life actually looked like. No idea that I was working 40 hours at retail and then going straight to class 3 nights a week. That I was studying during my breaks. That I was building skills they didn't even know I was interested in. That this retail job was just the current chapter, not the whole story. I went home that night and sat in my small apartment in the neighborhood that wasn't impressive, surrounded by the furniture that was functional but not nice, and I felt this familiar weight. Because they weren't wrong about my present circumstances. I was working retail. I was living in a cheap apartment. I was financially struggling in ways they clearly weren't. But they were wrong about what that meant. They were treating my present like my permanent. Like where I was now was where I was always going to be. Like the struggles I was having were evidence of who I was rather than evidence of a phase I was moving through. And that misunderstanding hurt more than outright judgment would have. Because judgment at least acknowledges that you're trying and failing. But this was just dismissal. This was them deciding I wasn't someone to take seriously anymore. That I'd become background. Someone you're polite to but don't really see as a peer. I started noticing this everywhere after that. The way people treated me differently when they found out what I did for work. The subtle condescension and questions about my plans. The way conversations would shift when I mentioned my apartment or my lack of a car or any of the other markers that I was struggling financially. And the hardest part was that I couldn't really defend myself. Because what was I going to say? That this was temporary? That I was building toward something better? That sounded like what everyone says when they're stuck and don't want to admit it. That sounded like denial. Like I couldn't accept my reality. But it was temporary. I knew it was temporary. Not in some delusional, I'm destined for greatness way, but in this very concrete way where I had a plan. I had milestones. I had specific skills I was building and credentials I was earning and a clear path from here to there. It was just going to take time. And in the meantime, I had to survive. Had to pay rent and buy groceries and function while I built towards something better. But nobody saw that. They just saw the retail job and made their conclusions. And I was too exhausted from actually doing the work of building something to spend energy trying to convince them they were wrong about me. So I stopped talking about it, stopped mentioning the classes I was taking or the skills I was building, started giving vague answers when people asked what I was up to. Just said I was working, which was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth, because sharing the whole truth meant exposing it to their doubt. And I needed to protect it, needed to keep my actual goals private where their underestimation couldn't touch them. And that made everything lonelier, because I was working so hard, spending every available moment building towards something better. Coming home from my retail shift exhausted and having to study, sacrificing social life and rest and everything else to invest in my future. And nobody saw any of that effort. They just saw someone working retail, someone struggling, someone who hadn't made it. I'd lie in bed some nights, too tired to sleep, and think about all the people who'd written me off, who'd decided I wasn't someone worth keeping up with, who'd made their judgments based on my current circumstances without considering that circumstances change. And sometimes that thought motivated me, made me determined to prove them all wrong, made me want to work harder so I could eventually show them what I'd built while they were dismissing me. But other times it just made me sad, made me wish someone could see what I was doing, could acknowledge the effort even if the results weren't visible yet, could understand that surviving while building is actually harder than just succeeding. Maybe you're in this place right now. Maybe you're working a job that doesn't reflect your actual capabilities. Maybe you're living in circumstances that don't represent your goals. Maybe people are making assumptions about who you are based on where you are, and they have no idea what you're actually doing while you survive. Here's what nobody tells you about building towards something better while barely making it. They don't tell you that the hardest part isn't the work itself. It's doing the work while people assume you're not doing any work at all. It's building while they think you're stagnating. It's moving forward while they've decided you're stuck. Because they can only see what's visible. Your current job, your current living situation, your current financial reality. They can't see the hours you're spending learning new skills. They can't see the progress you're making toward qualifications they don't know you're pursuing. They can't see the foundation you're building for a completely different future. And when they look at your present, they're not seeing a temporary phase. They're seeing what they assume is your permanent state. They're deciding that this is just who you are now. Someone who works that job. Someone who lives in that neighborhood. Someone who didn't make it. And once they've made that decision, everything you say about your plans sounds like denial. Like you can't accept your reality. But they're wrong about what your reality is. Your reality isn't just your present circumstances. Your reality is also your trajectory, your effort, your plan. The gap between where you are and where you're going. And that gap is invisible to them. They can't measure effort. They can only measure outcomes. So they judge you on outcomes without seeing the process that's creating different outcomes. And that judgment is heavy. Not because you believe it, but because you have to carry it on top of everything else you're carrying. You're already exhausted from working and studying and building. Already stretched thin from trying to survive while also investing in your future. Already running on minimal sleep and maximum stress. And now you also have to carry their underestimation. Their dismissal, their conclusion that you're someone who didn't make it. You can't defend yourself because defending yourself sounds defensive. You can't explain your plan because explaining sounds like making excuses. You can't share your progress because they'll just see the gap between where you are and where you're trying to go and use that gap as evidence that you're not going to make it. So you stay quiet. You let them have their judgments. You absorb their underestimation and file it away. And you keep working. Keep building. Keep showing up to both the survival job and the future you're creating. But you do it alone. Without validation. Without acknowledgement. Without anyone seeing how hard you're actually working. And the isolation of that is profound. Because you need someone to see you. Need someone to acknowledge that what you're doing is hard. That maintaining a job while building a future, while living on a tight budget, while dealing with everyone's assumptions is actually extraordinary. But instead you get treated like someone who's given up. Someone who's settled. Someone whose present is their permanent. The cruelest part is how they talk about you when you're not there. You know they do. You can feel it in how they interact with you. In the slightly pitying tone. In the way they don't ask follow-up questions about your life. In how quickly conversations move past you to people with more impressive updates. You're the cautionary tale. The one who didn't quite make it. The person they're grateful they're not. And you can't tell them they're wrong because you don't have proof yet. You just have effort. You just have a plan. You just have this belief that you're building towards something they can't see. And belief without evidence sounds like delusion. Sounds like you can't accept that this is your life now. But it's not your life. It's your foundation. It's what you're doing while you build the life. It's temporary. Strategic. It's the price you're paying now for the future you're creating. And they can't see that. They can only see now. And now isn't impressive. Now is struggling. Now is survival. Now is exactly what they decided you were going to be. So about 8 months after running into that person from high school, something shifted. I finished my program. Got my certification. Started applying to jobs in the field I'd been working toward. And I got one. A good one. Real career, real salary, real future. And I left the retail job. Left the cheap apartment. Started building the life I'd been working toward while everyone thought I was just surviving. And it felt like vindication. Like proof that I'd been right and they'd been wrong. Like finally being able to show them that their underestimation had been based on incomplete information. But then something unexpected happened. I ran into that same person again. Different context, different circumstances. And they recognized me. And I waited for that moment. That moment where I could casually mention my new job. Where I could show them how wrong they'd been. Where I could make them see that the person they'd dismissed had actually been building something the whole time. And we started talking. And they asked what I was up to. And I told them about the new job, the new apartment, the way things had changed. And I waited for surprise. For acknowledgement that they'd misjudged me. For some sign that they understood they'd written me off too early. But what I got was different. They said they'd always known I'd figure it out. That they'd always thought I was smart and capable. That they weren't surprised I'd landed on my feet. Like they'd been rooting for me the whole time. Like there had never been any dismissal or judgment or underestimation. And I stood there confused. Because that's not what had happened. That's not how they treated me. That's not what I'd felt in our last conversation. But arguing about it would make me look petty. Would make it seem like I'd been keeping score. Would reveal that their judgment had mattered to me more than I wanted to admit. So I just smiled and thanked them. And I walked away feeling strange. Not vindicated. Not satisfied. Just confused about what had actually happened between us. And over the next few weeks, I kept thinking about that interaction. And I started to realize something. The underestimation I'd felt, the judgment, the dismissal, some of it had been real. But some of it had been mine. Some of it had been my own shame about my circumstances projected onto other people. My own fear that my present was my permanent, disguised as their judgment. Because here's what I'd missed. Most people weren't thinking about me that much. They weren't making grand judgments about my life trajectory. They were just having a conversation, asking polite questions, then moving on with their own lives. And I was reading deep meaning into brief interactions because I was so worried about what my circumstances said about me. The person from high school probably had forgotten our conversation by the next day. Probably hadn't thought about me at all in the months between running into each other. Wasn't maintaining some file of evidence about how I hadn't made it. They just asked about my life, gotten an answer, and moved on. But I'd carried that interaction for months, had used it as fuel, had built it into this narrative about being underestimated and dismissed, had made them into a symbol of everyone who didn't see my potential, when really they'd just been someone making small talk who didn't know me well enough to understand my full situation. And I realized I'd been doing this with a lot of people. Taking neutral interactions and reading judgment into them. Assuming everyone was tracking my lack of success when most people were too busy with their own lives to think about mine. Creating this narrative where I was working against everyone's doubt when really I was mostly just working against my own circumstances. That didn't mean the struggle wasn't real. That didn't mean I hadn't been working incredibly hard. That didn't mean my circumstances hadn't been difficult. But it meant I'd been carrying extra weight that didn't need to be there. Defending myself against judgments that were mostly in my head. Fighting to prove people wrong who hadn't actually decided I was wrong. And weirdly, that realization was more freeing than the vindication I'd been craving. Because if they weren't tracking my failure, then I didn't need them to witness my success. If their underestimation was mostly my projection, then their validation didn't actually matter. I could just build my life without worrying about what anyone thought about it. So if you're in survival mode right now, if you're working a job that doesn't reflect your capabilities while building towards something better, if people are making assumptions about you based on your current circumstances, I need you to hear this. Some of their judgment is real, but some of it is your fear disguised as their opinion. And neither one actually matters as much as you think it does. What matters is the work you're doing, the skills you're building, the progress you're making that nobody sees, the foundation you're laying for a different future. That's real. That's substantial. That's what's going to determine where you end up, not what anyone thinks about where you are now. And yes, some people will underestimate you. Some people will write you off based on your present circumstances. Some people will decide you're not someone worth taking seriously. But most people aren't thinking about you enough to form those judgments. Most people are too busy with their own lives to maintain opinions about yours. And the ones who do judge, their judgment says more about them than it does about you. You don't need to prove them wrong. You really don't. You need to prove yourself right. You need to show yourself that you can do hard things. That you can survive while building. That you can maintain hope and effort and forward motion even when circumstances are difficult. That you can hold on to a vision of a different future even when your present doesn't reflect it yet. Write me a comment about what you're building while you survive. Not the survival job. The other thing. The skill you're developing. The credential you're earning. The plan you're executing one small step at a time. Tell me what they don't see. What they're going to be surprised by when it becomes visible. What you're doing in the hours between work and sleep that's creating a different future. And hit that like button if you're in temporary circumstances that people are treating as permanent. If you're working a survival job while building a career. If you're living below your future means to invest in that future. If you're being underestimated based on where you are instead of where you're going. Let's acknowledge that we're in the building phase. That what's visible isn't the whole story. That our present is foundation, not final. Tell me in the comments about a time when someone was surprised by your success because they'd underestimated you. Or if you're still in the building phase, tell me what keeps you going. What makes you keep showing up to both survival and building when most people would choose one or the other? Because I think we need to talk more honestly about this. About how hard it is to build while you survive. About how exhausting it is to carry other people's assumptions on top of your actual workload. About how lonely it is to work towards something that nobody sees yet. but also about how much of that judgment is real and how much is our own fear projected onto others. Let's build a space here where we can admit that we're struggling financially while working toward something better. Where we can be honest about the survival jobs and the cheap apartments and the tight budgets. But where we can also talk about what we're building in the margins. What we're learning. What we're working toward. What's going to change even though change isn't visible yet. And if you know someone who's in survival mode while building toward something better, someone who's being judged on their present without anyone seeing their trajectory, someone who's working harder than their circumstances suggest, send this to them. Tell them that temporary isn't permanent. Tell them that what people see isn't the whole story. Tell them that building while surviving is harder than just succeeding, and they're doing something extraordinary even if nobody acknowledges it. Maybe the point isn't to prove everyone wrong. Maybe it's to stop caring whether they're right or wrong about you. Maybe it's to recognize that their underestimation doesn't affect your trajectory unless you let it. Maybe it's to understand that most people aren't thinking about you enough to underestimate you, and the ones who are don't matter as much as your own commitment to what you're building. Keep surviving. Keep building. Keep showing up to both the thing that pays rent and the thing that's creating your future. Not to prove anyone wrong. Not to make anyone see. But because you deserve the future you're creating. Because temporary struggle in service of long-term goals is noble even when nobody witnesses it. Because you're building something that matters to you, and that's enough reason to keep going. They underestimate you now. They don't know what you're building. And honestly, they don't need to know. You don't need their belief or their acknowledgement or their validation. You just need your own commitment, your own effort, your own willingness to do hard things in hard circumstances for longer than is comfortable. That's what's going to make the difference. Not their opinion, not their judgment, not their eventual surprise when you succeed. Just your daily choice to keep building while you survive. And one day, when what you're building becomes visible, when your circumstances match your trajectory, when your present finally reflects your effort, you won't need to tell them they underestimated you. It'll just be obvious. And that obviousness, that undeniable evidence of what you built while they weren't paying attention, that's better than any vindication. That's the real victory. Not proving them wrong, but proving yourself right.